My chronicles involving marzipan, the last guinea pig in the world, are approaching their conclusion. After some trial and error, I now know what I think David Benatar said in his Better Never to Have Been about beginning and ending the lives and deaths of living beings, human, sentient or otherwise. My background story has been that I am the last human being alive, and my life is coming to its end. I have a dear animal companion, marzipan, who is in good health, but would probably spend the rest of her life in misery after I'm gone. The question has been, would the David Benatar of 2006 permit me to end marzipan's life before I go? I first thought that the answer is obvious. Of course, any compassionate person would allow me to spare the poor thing from the impending misery. But then, prompted by some of your comments, I made further inquiries, and it transpired that I could be wrongfully taking a life after all. And that's where we are now. The answer is in the box or in the book, but which one is it? For now, marzipan seems to be both dead and alive. As predicted at the end of episode 2, pages 218 and 219 solve the case for me. First this, life can be so bad that it is better to die. And then on the next page, thus I think that death is sometimes a harm and sometimes a benefit. And that's all I needed after my preliminary investigations to set the variables in place for my next task. As many of you have anticipated, my chronicles here do have a point beyond the death or not of a guinea pig, as fond as I have grown of her during the proceedings. Contrary to what some of you seem to have feared, however, marzipan is not a Trojan horse for smuggling in any normative views concerning lives and deaths and their continuation or discontinuation on a larger scale. Instead, I am concerned about interpretations. With what I think I know about Better Never to Have Been, my question is, how can its message be interpreted? So, let's cast our minds back to 2006. We have just read the book and we are especially interested in the rightness and wrongness of making lives appear and disappear. What we know is that this is a balancing act. Life is always bad, and being dead according to the book is always bad. But death can be less bad than life, and in this case making life disappear can be good. Let's consider the possibilities, starting from what we think about marzipan and proceeding to what might logically follow from our position and with what kinds of additional assumptions. To begin with, let's consider those who don't allow taking the guinea pig's life in my imaginary case. Their view could be based on the idea, possibly to be deduced from Better Never to Have Been, that taking lives is only allowed on the explicit request of those whose lives are taken. Benatar states that he allows voluntary euthanasia, so the admission is necessary. Nothing in this view prevents its champions from advocating voluntary childlessness. No one is killed in decisions not to have offspring. Interestingly, since Benatar emphasizes the extension to all sentient beings, this view is quite naturally coupled with vegan abolitionism. If one is opposed to human births, the breeding going on in factory farming cannot be seen as such a great practice either. Even more interestingly, those who want marzipan to live through her misery might still defend the sterilization of non-human animals in the wild. No one would be killed, yet the activity could prevent a considerable amount of suffering, which after all seems to be among Benatar's main goals. Anyway, at the other end of the continuum we find those who do allow the shortening of marzipAN's life in my example. Their primary motivations are probably compassion and a duty of care. As practical measures, they would promote voluntary childlessness, veganism, and maybe wildlife sterilization, like anyone abiding by Benatar's rules. But what else? To find out, let's take a look at what makes the case of my imaginary guinea pig analogical to real-life endeavors. Which features in the guinea pig case are normatively relevant? Sentience, for those who oppose hastening marzipAN's death, serves as a distinguishing factor. Benatar advocates early abortions, hence the killing of beings without an interest in their own lives. The case of the guinea pig is different. The major factor in this camp is that the lack of explicit outspoken consent forbids life-taking. The relational other regarding factors of compassion and duty of care are in this view something that can be ignored. These principles and choices may or may not be expressed word by word in Better Never to Have Been, but at least my knowledge of the book doesn't preclude them. If they are someone's reading, then they are. Not mine, but that's neither here nor there. The main motivation on the other side is probably the idea that sentience calls for compassion past autonomy, beyond the ability to say, put me out of my misery. If they suffer, we help them not to suffer. An accidental, I didn't plan it, but significant feature in my case is that marzipAN is not suffering yet. She is healthy and happy, while I'm taking care of her and keeping her company. It's the reasonably expected misery after I'm gone that justifies her induced demise. Two further principles are needed to support the decision to shorten her life. First, I have to be responsible for her, and I think I am because of a legal idea that goes by the name of the but-for rule. And secondly, omissions, decisions not to do things, must be normatively in the same category with acts, decisions to actively do something. These two principles need a little explanation. The but-for notion of responsibility states that if I have causally and intentionally contributed to it, I am, maybe with others but still, responsible for it. But for my choice, it would not have been, means that I too am responsible for it. And applied to our case, but for my insistence on having a non-human companion, marzipAN would not have been. So, I'm responsible for her, I have a duty of care to her. The equivalence of acts and omissions principle states that from a normative point of view, it doesn't matter if I contribute to something by making it happen or by letting it happen. When I know the consequences and intend them, I am responsible for them. I am not acquitted by the fact that I just refused to prevent harm, as in I stood back and allowed her to die in misery. Now, if those are our convictions, what does Better Never to Have Been tell us to do? The things already mentioned are given: voluntary childlessness, veganism, and maybe wildlife sterilizations. But there could be more. Preemptive wildlife care, meaning that since there is so much suffering out there, perhaps we should wipe out insentient species to hasten the process. And while we are at it, humans could, not against their will, but not necessarily asking the explicit permission either, be helped to reduce their birth rates. Perhaps contraceptives to all and reproduction only by licensing would be relatively acceptable. No coercion, of course. What I'm trying to say here is simply that many interpretations are logically possible. Let me summarize the findings of my imaginary case by an imaginary review that I could have written in 2006 had I read the book back then. David Benatar presents a modern version of philosophical pessimism based on the view that both life and death are serious harms to be avoided. His detailed analysis supports a variety of normative conclusions ranging from voluntary childlessness to veganism and the obliteration of life on Earth and beyond. Were this antinatal, his incidental coinage, ethics ever discussed further, which for its esoteric nature I doubt, it could easily give rise to conflicting interpretations. And that's all from me for now. It only remains to say thank you and P.S. Many of you have hoped to hear what David Benatar himself has to say about these things now, 20 years later. Your wish being my command, I have asked him if he'd be willing to do this. He is understandably busy, but has agreed to consider it if there is sufficient demand. To show him that there is, you can express your support by giving a thumbs up in the first comment box below. No doubt he will tear apart my feeble attempts, but hey, all in a day's work can't win them all, and what have you. Can't wait.